Deep winter. 1942. The Eastern Front. For the soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, stationed on the frozen tundra of southern Russia, night no longer meant rest. Here, darkness had taken on a new, lethal meaning. Place yourself in that scene. You are a young German soldier, huddled in a trench, covered by heavy snow. The temperature outside has dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, perhaps even lower. Your breath freezes into ice crystals on your mustache. You dare not light a fire, because on this open snowfield, even the faintest spark could attract a Soviet sniper's bullet or a barrage of long-range artillery. You wrap yourself in a thin military blanket, trying to sleep amidst the bone-chilling cold and the fear of death. Suddenly, you hear a sound. It is not a sound you recognize from modern warfare. It is not the roar of a Messerschmitt engine, not the heart-stopping scream of a Stuka bomber, nor the earth-shaking rumble of heavy tanks crushing the frozen earth. This sound is light. It is soft. It does not belong to a steel machine. It sounds like the wind sweeping through dry leaves, or perhaps more accurately, like a giant broom sweeping through the air. A soft, rhythmic whoosh. When you hear that sound, your heart skips a beat, because you know it is already too late. In the next second, without any warning, a massive explosion tears through the sky. Dirt flies, shrapnel sprays, and camp sirens scream. German soldiers wake from their dreams in a panic, rushing out of tents, firing madly into the pitch-black sky. Tracer rounds cut red streaks through the air. Searchlights sweep the clouds in desperation, but there is nothing there. You cannot see a plane. You cannot hear an engine. There is only that strange, ghostly rushing of air, fading away into the darkness. The next morning, surviving veterans turn pale as they warn the fresh recruits who have just arrived at the front. Watch out for the sounds at night. If you hear the Broom, pray. The Nachthexen are coming. Nachthexen. That is German for night witches. They were not ghosts, nor were they monsters from Germanic folklore. They were the Soviet 588th Night Bomber Regiment. This was a unit unique in the history of human warfare. It was composed entirely of women, from the regiment commander to the pilots, from the navigators to the mechanics, and even the armorers loading the bombs. Every single one was a woman. The average age of these girls was just 20. Some were not yet 18. This group, considered a living nightmare by the Germans, flew wooden planes that couldn't even crop dust properly. They had no parachutes, no radios, no radar, and no protective armor. Flying these primitive machines, known as flying coffins, they launched 24,000 air raids over the next 1,100 nights, dropping 3,000 tons of bombs and dragging the elite troops of the German army to the brink of mental collapse. This is not just a story about courage. Courage is not rare in war. This is a story about how to survive impossible odds, relying on wisdom, skill, and willpower that transcends human limits, to humiliate the world's most powerful air force. To understand why there were witches, we must go back to the summer of 1941. That year, for the Soviet Union, was the beginning of hell. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany tore up the Non-Aggression Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion in human history. 3 German army groups acted like a sharp scalpel, slicing through the fragile defense lines of the Soviet Red Army. In the first few months of the war, Soviet losses were catastrophic. Millions of soldiers were killed or captured in massive encirclements. The Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground. Thousands of planes were turned into burning scrap metal before they could even take off. By autumn, German tank tracks were approaching the outskirts of Moscow. Through binoculars, German officers could even see the spires of the Kremlin. The country was bleeding. Its arteries had been cut. It needed everyone who could hold a gun, every soul capable of fighting. In this atmosphere of desperation, the traditional values of Soviet society began to crumble. Women were no longer just nurses in the rear or laborers in factories. They were pushed to the edge of war. At this critical juncture, a legendary figure stepped forward. Her name was Marina Raskova. If you lived in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, you couldn't help but know that name. She was a super idol of that era, with a status comparable to a rock star today. She was a famous female pilot who had broken countless long-distance flight records and was one of the first women to be awarded the title, Hero of the Soviet Union. Her smile appeared on newspapers, posters, and postage stamps. After the war broke out, Raskova's desk was piled high with letters from women across the country. The stationery varied, the handwriting varied, but the content was shockingly consistent. Marina, I want to fly. I want to defend the motherland. I want to kill the enemy. Please, give me a plane. These letters came from university students, from farm women and collectives, from factory workers. They didn't want to just bandage wounds in the rear. They wanted revenge on the front lines. Raskova was deeply moved by these letters. Using her personal influence and her halo as a hero, she petitioned Soviet leader Joseph Stalin directly. She proposed an idea that seemed completely insane, even heretical at the time. To establish 3 air combat regiments composed entirely of women. Note that this was not asking for women to do auxiliary work. Raskova proposed creating full combat units, pilots, navigators, mechanics repairing the planes, armorers loading the ammunition, all roles filled by women. This was unprecedented in the history of warfare. The military high command strongly opposed this. It was a male-dominated era, and generals generally believed that women physically could not withstand the hygiene of aerial combat and psychologically could not face the brutality of the battlefield. They thought women would panic and become a burden to the army. Some even mocked, "Are we going to let the enemy see our braids on the battlefield?" But facing the threat of national extinction, Stalin had no choice. He needed every ounce of strength available. On October 8, 1941, Order No. 122 was officially signed. According to this order, the Soviet Union would form 3 female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Night Bomber Regiment, and the protagonist of our story, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The which units were born. As soon as the news broke, thousands of young girls flocked to the recruitment centers. After rigorous screening, a few hundred lucky ones were selected and sent to the Engels Aviation School on the banks of the Volga River. These girls were mostly very young, averaging only 20 years old. They came from all walks of life. Mathematics majors from Moscow State University, textile factory workers, girls who had just graduated from high school and hadn't even had time to attend their prom. Their original dreams were to become teachers, doctors, scientists, or artists. But now, they cut off their beloved long hair. It was a ritual, symbolizing that they were saying goodbye to their identity as girls and becoming warriors. However, upon arriving at Engels, the first enemy waiting for them was not the brutal Germans, but the chaotic logistics of the Soviet army. The Soviet army at the time had absolutely no supplies prepared for female soldiers. There was no such thing as a female uniform. The quartermasters issued them old uniforms left behind by male soldiers at the front. Imagine a group of girls, averaging less than 5 feet 3 inches tall with slender frames, wearing rough wool greatcoats, designed for 6-foot-tall men. These coats hung on them like giant sacks. The sleeves had to be rolled up several times, just to reveal their hands, and the hems dragged on the ground, sweeping up dust. The worst part was the boots. The army issued standard men's combat boots. The smallest size was a 40 or 41, but these girls' feet were usually size 35 or 36. Wearing such gigantic boots, let alone running, even walking normally was difficult. The boots would fall off with every step. To move in these boots, the girls had to tear up the bed sheets in their dorms into strips, wrapping them layer upon layer around their feet like mummies, stuffing the empty space inside the boots. Even so, on the training ground, they waddled like penguins. The male instructors and pilots at the Engels base were full of contempt. They stood by the runway, looking at these girls in comical coats, laughing harshly. They placed bets. These dolls won't last a month. They'll cry for their mothers the first time they see blood. A waste of gasoline. The sexism was open and undisguised, but in that environment, the girls had no right to argue. They could only grit their teeth and swallow their tears. Training was compressed to the extreme. In peacetime, it took 2 to 3 years to train a qualified bomber pilot and navigator. But now, with the front lines in crisis, they had to learn everything in 6 months. It was a hellish period. They trained 14 to 16 hours a day. In addition to flight theory and navigation techniques, they underwent high-intensity physical training. No holidays, No weekends, not even private time. In this closed base, they were forced to forget they were women. Due to stress and malnutrition, many girls stopped menstruating. But no one dared to complain. They knew the only way to prove themselves was to fly better than the men. When the 6 months of hellish training ended and Raskova finally revealed their warplanes to them, the girls' hearts sank. They were full of anticipation, thinking they would be flying sleek fighters like the Yak-1 or heavily armored attack aircraft like the L-2. Appearing in the hangar was a row of antiques that looked like they had been dragged out of a museum, the Polikarpov Po-2. What kind of plane was this? It was a biplane designed in 1928, filled with the style of World War I before the war. It was a primary trainer for Soviet flying clubs, or used to dust pesticides on collective farms. The Soviets gave it an affectionate but slightly mocking nickname, the kukuruznik, the corn duster. But on the brutal Eastern Front, it had a more accurate, more despairing name, the burning coffin. Let's look closely at the specs of this plane, and you will see how insane it was to send it into battle. First, the material. This plane was not made of metal. Its airframe was wood and plywood, and the wings, brace yourself, the wings were just wooden frames covered with a layer of canvas. Yes, ordinary canvas, coated with a special varnish to harden it. This meant it had zero ballistic protection, let alone anti-aircraft guns. Even an infantryman with a standard rifle, or even a pistol, could easily punch through the fuselage. Sitting inside was like sitting in a paper lantern. Second, the speed. The Po-2's top speed was only 150 kilometers per hour. Flying against a headwind, it was sometimes slower than the trucks on the ground. That's barely faster than the military motorcycles equipped by the German army at the time. By contrast, the Luftwaffe's main fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-109, flew at over 600 kilometers per hour. Sending a Po-2 to fight an Mi-109 was like riding a childless bicycle to crash into a full-speed Ferrari. Even more deadly, this plane was primitive to the extreme. So primitive it lacked even the most basic modern aviation equipment. It had no radio. Because radio equipment was too heavy, the plane couldn't carry it. In the air, the girls could only communicate in the most primitive ways. Waving hands during the day, rocking their wings, or flashing flashlights in Morse code at night. This meant that if one plane was shot down or got lost, she couldn't call for help. She could only face death alone. It had no radar. Not even decent navigation instruments. Navigators had to rely on maps, stopwatches, compasses, and observing fires and terrain on the ground to tell direction. In the pitch-black winter night, this was practically suicidal. It had no defensive machine guns. The plane was never designed for combat. If they encountered enemy planes, they had no way to fight back. They could only pray or wait to die. It didn't even have protective armor. There was no steel plate behind the pilot's seat. Any bullet fired from behind would go straight through the seat back and hit the spine. Most chilling of all, until 1944, to carry 2 extra bombs. Commanders ordered, no parachutes allowed. This was a brutally cold calculation. The Po-2 had terrible load-bearing capacity. A parachute weighed about 15 to 20 kilograms. If they flew without parachutes, 2 crew members saved about 40 kilograms, which was just enough to carry a few more small bombs. This meant if you were hit and caught fire, you had 2 choices. Burn to death inside the plane, or jump and fall to your death. There was no third way. This was their weapon, a kite stuck together with glue, wood, and canvas. When these young girls climbed into this primitive cockpit for the first time, they must have thought, is Tease a joke? Given such inferior equipment, how did they become legends? Why did the Germans fear these broken planes? Because these clever girls discovered the Po-2 as only advantage and turned it into a deadly weapon. It was too slow. This sounds contradictory, but in the physics of aerial dogfighting, this became their talisman. For German ace pilots, attacking a Po-2 was a massive headache, because modern German fighters were too fast. The top speed of the Po-2 was even lower than the stall speed of a German fighter. This meant that if a German fighter wanted to tail a Po-2 to aim, he had to slow down. But if he slowed down that much, the German fighter would lose lift and crash. So, the Germans found it difficult to shoot them down easily. They could only fire in the split second of a high-speed pass, which required extreme skill. Furthermore, utilizing this slowness in the biplane's excellent gliding performance they invented a terrifying tactic. Usually, they would fly deep in the night. The plane would fly to within a few kilometers of the target. At this point, the pilot would do something that went against all aviation common sense and was extremely dangerous. They would cut the engine. In that instant, the roar of the engine vanished. The world became dead silent, save for the wind at high altitude. The plane began to glide through the night sky. Because the Po-2 was light and the double wings provided massive lift, it could drift toward German positions like a feather, silent and undetected. No sound. No heat signature. Searchlights couldn't find them. The Germans' advanced acoustic locators couldn't hear them. They glided like ghosts over the German lines, right over the heads of the German soldiers. Until that sound like a broom sweeping the air, the whoosh-whoosh began. The pilot pulled the cable, and the bombs hooked under the wings dropped. Boom! Boom! Only amidst the chaos and fire of the explosion would they restart the engine. The Po-2's engine would cough, then roar to life. Using the confusion on the ground, they escaped at full speed, vanishing into the darkness. This tactic caused massive psychological trauma to the Germans. Imagine never knowing when a bomb might fall because there was no sound. German soldiers were driven to nervous breakdowns. They couldn't sleep, couldn't light fires, living in constant terror. They became superstitious, believing these Soviet female pilots took special pills that gave them night vision, or that the planes were made of special invisible materials. Thus, the name Night Witches was born. This was not mockery. It was a title born of deep fear. A rumor even circulated within the Luftwaffe. Any pilot who shot down a witch would be automatically awarded an Iron Cross, because it was simply that difficult. But do not think this was easy. It was torture on the limits of human physiology. Because the Po-2's payload was so small, it could only carry 2 slightly larger bombs, or a handful of small incendiaries. To cause enough damage, they had to use ant-style tactics. One plane, in one night, didn't fly once, but 8 to 10 times, sometimes even 15 times. The famous pilot, Nachthexen, recalled that on nights of intense fighting, she set a record of 18 sorties in a single night. Think about what that means. Take off, fly over the front lines in the dark, cut the engine, drop bombs, dodge anti-aircraft fire, escape, land. That is terrifying enough, but when they landed, there was no rest. Ground crews had to hang new bombs and refuel in 5 minutes. The pilot couldn't even leave the cockpit. She would drink a sip of water, then immediately take off again. An entire night was spent in this cycle of life and death. When dawn broke, many girls were so exhausted they didn't have the strength to climb out of the cockpit. They had to be lifted out by their comrades. Even more terrifying was the cold. The Po-2 was an opened cockpit plane. There was no canopy, no heating. You were directly exposed to the air. In the Russian winter, the air temperature at altitude was minus 30 degrees. With the wind chill factor, it felt lower than minus 50. The wind cut like a knife, and goggles frosted over. This cold would eat you alive. If you took off your glove to operate a precision navigation instrument or fix a jammed machine gun, the skin of your fingers would instantly stick to the freezing metal. When you tried to pull your hand away, the skin would tear right off, leaving bloody wounds. Many girls were carried out of their planes like ice sculptures after a mission. Their legs were frozen stiff and could not bend. Speaking of ground crews, we must mention these unsung heroes. The mechanics and armorers of this air regiment were also all women. Their working environment was even worse than the pilots. In the cold winter nights, to maintain finger dexterity to tighten tiny screws or load fuses, the mechanics often couldn't wear thick gloves. They worked with bare hands in the snow at minus 40 degrees. Their hands cracked, and the blood that flowed out froze instantly. Some mechanics, to prevent bomb fuses from freezing and failing, would tuck the fuses inside their own coats, warming them with their body heat. Those were things that could explode at any moment, but they held the bombs like they were holding children. The navigator's job was even more suicidal. Because the Po-2 lacked bomb sights, the navigator had to lean halfway out of the cockpit, observing the target with a naked eye in the howling wind, calculating the lead, and pulling the release cable. Sometimes, the crude bomb racks would freeze and jam. In these moments, the navigator had to unbuckle her safety belt, climb out of the cockpit, stand on the slippery wing strut with hundreds of meters of empty air and enemy bullets below, and kick the bombs loose with her feet. One slip of the hand, one bump of the plane, and she would fall to her death, shattered to pieces. As the war progressed, the Germans got smarter. They realized that conventional dogfighting tactics didn't work against these slow planes. So they developed tactics specifically for the witches. They brought in specialized night fighters and organized walls of search. This was a deadly combination. On the ground, dozens of powerful searchlights would switch on simultaneously, turning a patch of night sky into daylight. Once a Po-2 was caught in the beams, it was finished. The canvas skin became transparent in the intense light. The pilot had nowhere to hide. The glare would instantly blind the pilot, causing her to lose all sense of direction. The most tragic night occurred during the Kuban air battle in 1943, along the famous Blue Line. The Germans set a carefully planned trap. When the first wave of witches glided in as usual, the ground anti-aircraft guns maintained a deathly silence. The girls felt something was wrong, but the arrow was knocked. They had to fly on. Suddenly, every searchlight on the ground lit up at once. The beams of light, like prison bars, pinned several Po-2 south against the sky. Immediately, a Messerschmitt, Bf 1010 night fighter that had been lying in wait, dove in. For this steel killer equipped with autocannons, the hovering Po-2 south were like cakes sitting on a plate. That night, Soviet infantry on the ground witnessed a scene that would break their hearts and stay with them forever. 4 Po-2 south, like 4 giant, burning torches, fell slowly from the sky. Inside were 8 young girls. Because they had no parachutes, they couldn't jump. They didn't scream over the radio. They didn't even cry. Some witnesses said that before the burning planes hit the ground, they saw the aircraft still trying to adjust their course, trying to crash into the German searchlight batteries or ammo dumps. Since they couldn't escape, they turned their planes into the final weapon and themselves into the final bullet. Nadezhda Popova later recalled that it was the longest night of her life. As one of the first survivors to fly back, she watched her comrades burn beside her. When she landed, her plane had 42 bullet holes kisses left by German machine guns some just centimeters from her head. But she couldn't stop. The commander, with tears in her eyes, ordered, "Load bombs, take off." Popova wiped away her tears, drank a shot of vodka, and climbed back into that battered plane. She had to go back. She had to let the Germans know that the witches were not dead yet. Despite paying such a massive price, the 588th Regiment later awarded the honorary title of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment for their distinguished service. This group of originally fragile girls was forged into steel in the fires of war. They fought all the way from the Caucasus Mountains to Crimea, liberated Belarus, and finally fought to the outskirts of Berlin. The entire regiment flew 24,000 sorties and dropped 3,000 tons of bombs. This unit produced 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest honor medal in the USSR. This was an astonishing achievement. Even elite male units struggled to reach such heights. But the ending of the story isn't like a Hollywood movie with a perfect wrap-up. In 1945, Germany surrendered. A grand victory parade was held in Moscow's Red Square. This should have been their most glorious moment. However, this legendary unit was absent. Why? The reason was absurd, realistic, and sounds almost cruel. The official censors believed their planes to Wooden Po-2 south that had performed such heroic feats were too simple, too shabby. They were deemed unsuitable to appear in a parade showcasing the Soviet Union's powerful, modern military might and steel torn. It would make the mighty Red Army look like a backward peasant army. And a more chilling reason was about image. Because these girls had spent years squeezed into cramped cockpits, combined with wearing heavy boots and suffering long-term malnutrition. Many had leg injuries and walked with a gait that wasn't pretty enough. It wasn't masculine enough. So, the witches who had guarded the country through countless dark nights with their lives were left in the stands. They could only watch as spectators while the male soldiers drove shiny tanks and goose-stepped perfectly across Red Square, accepting the cheers of the leader and the people. In that moment, the taste in their hearts was perhaps more bitter than the burning night sky over Kuban. After the war, the regiment was quickly disbanded. These warriors, who had once made Nazis tremble, took off those ill-fitting uniforms and put their skirts back on. They returned to school to finish their studies, returned to factories, got married, and had children. Soviet society seemed eager for them to forget the war and return to traditional female roles. They locked that memory in a drawer and hid their heavy medals in the deepest part of the closet. For a long time, no one knew that the kind grandmother next door knitting sweaters had once been a night witch harvesting Nazi souls in the dark. It wasn't until decades later, when historians opened the dusty archives, that people realized the weight of this history. The Luftwaffe, Ace, Johann Steinhoff, once said, "We simply could not believe that the Soviet airmen who caused us the greatest trouble were in fact women." These women feared nothing. This is the story of the night witches. They flew the slowest planes of World War II, yet achieved the fastest legend. They wore boots 5 sizes too big, yet walked the hardest road of the war. They were called witches by the enemy, but to a nation in despair, they were true guardian angels. They didn't need magic, because they themselves were the miracle.